Good morning. This is Dr. Stacy Lyle. This is for Module 7. We're going to talk about surface right-of-ways and water rights. In this section, we're going to go through and look at who owns the right-of-ways, on a surface or in public right-of-ways, and then water rights on the surface or public right-of-ways. And we'll go through and understand the concepts of right-of-ways and water ownership, and then the goal will be to go through and to take some of the right-of-way information as a project and actually add that onto a piece of property and describe, who you think owns it, and then build a quick story map on the right-of-way for the water rights. Now, one of the things that we'll also do in here is that we will look at some videos, and the videos are focusing on key things. There's a good legal aspect that is gone through about ownership of right-of-ways across private persons. Gary Kent, good surveyor, I know, he goes through a good section on right-of-ways through this section. And then there's a piece here on groundwater ownership in a current court case that's pending in Lubbock, Texas, that we will want to look at as well. Now, in terms of the readings that we have, on the reading section, I have a good published paper I wrote several years ago because of an issue that was dealing with who owned the minerals under the right-of-ways. And so look at that. Chapter 6, I'll cover that, so I'll have that in the video, but you can go back and read that. And then there's some good portions about the water right-of-ways, a lot of information on water right-of-ways, and I've got some good links that you can read from that standpoint. Okay, but looking at right-of-ways. So what is a right-of-way and how did it come across? So landowners typically will have title to the center line unless the land was dedicated through a fee simple. So what does that mean? So if you look at a piece of property, even in your neighborhood, you actually own to the center line of that unless the road was purchased by the county or the city. If the road is dedicated for public use, if the county or city ever decides to abandon that county road or subdivision road, then the land would vest to the adjoiners, unless the land was entirely inside the piece of property. Okay, then it would go to a totally towards that person that originally dedicated it. Unless the land was transferred through a fee simple way. Roads are typically dedicated to the public as an easement. Dedicated roads will not increase or decrease if distributing accesses and deficiencies. And so you will not add more if you had say a simultaneous conveyance and there was a road in between several tracks. You would not grow the right-of-way, giving it more because there is an excess or deficiency. Roads are considered to be senior, and so they get what they get, and then any remainder or excess is distributed to the remaining individuals. Okay, so now knowing that, who owns the minerals to that? So it goes back to the topic of what was really given. Now, when the state got these rights, unless they purchased the minerals, they left the minerals to the original owner. We go back through old wagon trails that went through people's properties, the Johnson Trail through somebody's property. So that would stay with the mineral owners. When Texas went apart getting right-of-ways and purchasing them, they would buy the minerals in terms of not allowing you to go through and excavate for gravel or sand or minerals so that you would disrupt the right-of-way. They left the subsurface minerals to the original owners. Okay, but if there was a fee taking, so let's say that the road was dedicated at one time, and then what happens is then the state decided to widen that road, so they purchase additional road to the side of that. So you might have a right-of-way in here that's a certain length, and then maybe they extended that right of way and they purchased this. If this was dedicated and that is purchased, then who owns this portion? Well, what happens at that process is that really the state abandons the right of way to the owners of the adjoiners. Now they're the owners, so now the state owns it by fee simple. So they would get that portion, and when they purchased these expanded right of ways, they probably left the minerals. They're not concerned of getting the minerals, but if they did get those minerals, then it would go towards the original mineral landowner. Now, what's the difference between a right of way and an easement? An easement is the right to do something across somebody's property. It's not ownership. Dedication is somewhat ownership, okay, but it doesn't vest indefinitely, and you cannot adverse onto an right of way. But let's look at easements. Now, an easement is the right to use real property of another. So the dominant, has access across the servient. You might say that the dominant lays their whip across the servient's back, and so that the servient is now encumbered with this easement. If the servient sells this property to another landowner, that landowner gets this encumbrance, and that property is considered, a little bit less in value because it has this easement. Now you'll need to look at what the easement says. Is the easement an ingress or egress, enter or exit? Or is the ingress, egress meaning transportation across this? Is it transportation of utilities, right? Let's say that they want to allow somebody to come in here and drill for oil and gas, and they have that. And the servient down here, there's an easement. Do they allow them to, the dominant, to let others traverse across their work to get to their home? Now the dominant, when they have this easement, they can allow anyone to use their easement to come see them. They can't bar their mother from coming to see them. Nor could they bar somebody to come over here and service their house or build something. They couldn't stop them from doing that. But let's say that there's another tract down here beside them, right? And then the dominant gives an easement to them across there. Can this dominant give the easement to this person? That can't happen. The person here would have to get an easement from this person and from that person. So we look at the ingress, egress right of ways. Is it for utilities? Is it for drainage? Did it grant the use, not the title? Can build a pipeline, can service a pipeline, can ingress, egress, can erect signs. So pipeline easement across a property is that itself an easement. But an easement is a boundary, okay? And you must show boundaries when you're looking at land surveying, where you're required to show boundaries. Because why is it a boundary? Well, because the servient cannot build over this area, nor can the servient build over this pipeline. They have a boundary there. Now they could use and maybe graze and do some things on here, but the pipeline company would not want you to build a house or a barn or anything. They might allow erecting of a fence, but they're going to be limited to what you do on these easements, and you have to really read the easement to understand what it is. But it is a boundary, and really it becomes an unusual boundary in our land records because we have to treat it like a separate layer than the actual parcel boundaries or mineral boundaries, because this easement boundary is a rights boundary, not necessarily an ownership boundary. Sometimes easements are fee. The taking of this, you might see that they required them to purchase it, not necessarily just take it. So now let's talk about water boundaries. Now, water boundaries are typically natural boundaries, and therefore if the water or the waterway moves, the boundary moves. In that you need to understand, is the boundary that you own, say the distance between the two shores halfway between, or is it the deepest thread? So if you're trying to determine where that boundary is, you have a land over on this side, land over on this side, you have this thread in here, which would be the deepest, or the thalweg, which would be, take this side, take that side, take the average. It would be between those two. Or you have boundaries like for littoral or lake boundaries, where is the banks? Sometimes that is the high water, or the mean high water, or the elevation around a lake. You'll need to know that. So let's talk about that boundary and what it has to do with streams and creeks, which is the riparian boundary. To begin with, you need to look at what happens when it moves. Let's say that there is a slow buildup or accretion. Accretion, like secretion, it'll build up and add land to an area. And if that, say for example, was to build up, would the boundary move from here to there? Yes, it would. And so, would it move up? It would move from here to there, and this person potentially could gain land from that standpoint. Let's say that in a bend like this, it washes away. Currently, here's the boundary. Now here's the new washout. It would go to maybe this new location for the erosion of that portion. But what happens in an evulsive state, like it quickly jumps bank? The stream used to go up here and now goes down here, and you get these little oxbow lakes. If it happens quickly, now typically if this is a state-owned waterway or a navigable stream, the state will always get their share. So previously, you went to the bank and the individual owned maybe that one was up to that portion for that land ownership, and this one went somewhere in here like this, and they owned that portion. Well, what happens in this scenario is that you're going to have that this person still owns this portion, and they actually, because they've lost some land here, they will get from that bank to that bank, they will get that portion, plus they'll get half that lake. They will own this piece, the person on this side, and the person up here will own where they had owned before. They don't get additional land. They own where they had before, over here and over here, but they now do get half the lake. So you've got a person that you really have, this is the boundary for the north person, and this is the boundary for the south person. This is a rare occurrence that this happens, but I just want to explain how that happens and how we decide that. Now on littoral boundaries, which is that we call it the reliction, the pulling back of the sea or a big sand deposit, the upland landowner, which might be a private landowner, he would have the land that would grow. The sub-ocean or the sub-bottom or the water here would have own the land that's owned by the state, and the state would lose if that happens. And if it washes out, the state would get more land from that land. Land is added and enjoyed by the landowner. The lake boundary might be the original thalweg or thread of a stream. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's say that there is a stream that came up through here and made a lake, and now there's a boundary over here for this lake. Now it might be that the landowner could own to the original thread of that lake. The lake diversion case in the state of Texas is a good example of that. Individuals were going to where the bridge crossed the lake and got on the lake and were fishing, but this is a private lake, and the landowners actually owned right up to the stream. Although the stream was navigable, you could only be in the navigable portion, even if it's now totally submerged. It didn't grow the state's ownership because it was dammed up. It didn't happen over a slow occurrence, and that's a good court case to look at. But let's talk about the navigability of a stream and who owns it. You got streams like the Colorado and the Nueces, the Sabine, the Brazos, the Trinity, that flow big navigable streams that flow through the state. You have to look throughout time how they were owned, because the time periods, there were some laws in the Spanish and Mexican that did not carry over, but it wasn't until we actually had our Constitution in the state of Texas ratified. So in 36 they basically or 35 they actually basically became a state, but in 37 is when they set the rules that said if a stream is navigable, then it is owned by the state. If it is a stream that is non-navigable but perennial, which is perennial, well, perennial means it flows most of the year. A good example of that would be like the Frio River. The Frio River. That would say that the state owns that if it's non-navigable but perennial. And I'll explain how do we know if it's navigable. If it's non-navigable and non-perennial, then the center line is typically the ownership. Or if it's totally within your property, then you totally own that piece of property. Now, the state sometimes gave away by accident river beds that they should have retained because they were considered perennial or non-navigable or navigable, but the state went across it and gave away the tract. There's actually a way you need to fix that. But let's talk about what's a gradient boundary and how do you determine that, and what is a navigable. The law for navigable for the state, it comes after March 1836. Some dates in there, and so you might find properties that kind of stagger when they were given away. But let's say it is the average from the mouth up. So we're looking at it being from like 60 to 0. So everywhere it's 30 feet, it's considered navigable. And if you start getting up to here, less than 30, then you might no longer be navigable. And that's the mouth. This could be a stream that hits maybe a bigger river, say the Trinity, and this is like the small Plum Creek. Well, Plum Creek is wider here at 30 feet. When it hits the Trinity, the Plum Creek might be navigable for that portion, and then the state would own it. But where's the state's boundary? You know, the bank of the stream. Where's the bank? They consider that to be called the gradient boundary, and I'll explain how that works. But after this perennial, non-perennial time frame, okay, who owns it? Again, prior to 87, if it was perennial, the state owned it. After that, non-perennial, non-navigable, again, it went to the center line. If it was a adjoining boundary, or if it was totally in somebody's property, then they would own it from that standpoint. So kind of to summarize, Spanish Mexican, if it's a navigable stream totally in there, the state owns it. Spanish Mexican, if it's totally within the property and it's non-navigable, non-perennial though, down here, it'll jump on my screen here. This should say the state owns it, the state owns it. The landowner would own it if it's non-navigable and non-perennial from that standpoint. But if it totally goes through your property and you know it's the state's, let's say it's up here, so it's considered to be non-navigable but the perennial. So the Frio River went through somebody, but they gave them 640 acres. Well, now they don't own 640 acres because this is owned by the state and the state has the rights to this. Well, I want to lease 640 acres of land for oil and gas rights. Can I lease that now that the state really has navigable bills to that? The state will quit any right that it has. There was something called the small bill. It's not small, it's the name of the actual legislator who wrote it. Can be used to give landowners to make up for the lost acreage, but does not impede the public's access. So if you wanted to sell your 640, but you need the state to quit that claim to that, you use the small bill, they'll quit that claim to that. You can sell that for the mineral rights, but again, this is still navigable, so people can canoe it and walk up and down and enjoy it on the Frio River, but now you can sell the mineral rights to it. It's a little complex to understand, but it does occur. Now, during the Republic, the state of Texas, if it's navigable, again, the state owns it. If it's non-navigable but perennial prior to this date, because you remember we're 35, so we got like 2 years, the state would own it. But after 35, they gave it to the landowner. And again, the sawbill can still be used if there's a case where they gave it during that time frame, to kind of see it from that standpoint. Okay, well, that describes the land ownerships and the different rules and laws to try to understand who owns it. The best way to look at trying to determine whether this is a navigable or non-navigable, you got to look at the date of the lease or the patent or the survey when it was given away, and understand all those dates to determine it. But you can always just contact the General Land Office to see whether they think it is. I'll show an example of one that I've done here for you so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so let's go in and look at an area where I had a navigable stream concern come in. I'm going to go up here in the East Texas area, actually into Harris County here. And we see a stream coming across here. Looks like a fairly large screen, and you can see that this stream, right, seems to be one where it's not they did stop and did not give land through the original land grants on either side. Now you can see right here they started to give land on either side of this stream, but up until that point they were considering it a navigable stream. But now we see a piece here where they gave across the stream, and then we have a creek that goes through here, and we see, okay, well, they gave across this creek, and then we have this piece right here. Now I looked at it, it seems to me like if they drew the boundary to the end right here, then the state must own that stream. You know, reading the legal descriptions for it, it wasn't very clear, but in my opinions, I was designing this well right here, and I made the decision to say that the state owned this portion of land from that scenario. And so therefore, when I went in and I made my plat, I designed it with where we thought that this track through here, you know, you can see we got it from the state of Texas. And so when we built up this piece that we went through there and looked at, we then added to our records of ownership of who owned that track. We actually came in and said, oh, you know, that's going to be a piece that is partly of the state. So we had 14 acres in here that we had to go with the state, and so I had to go through and have that surveyed and determined from that scenario. But then when I look back down, I said, okay, well, you know, there was these other surveys or other people in this area, and what did they do, you know, when they got to this stream? So a lot of them fell short because they didn't want to deal with the stream. When I looked at the one that was here, they actually also fell short, decided not to try to question the ownership of that portion, and they would fall short of that stream and not try to work with the state. And I ended up working with the state. It all went well. I just had to justify what they thought they had. For the most part, when the state goes in there and looks at what they do, they use their GIS. So if we go to the Texas GLO GIS and we look at their GIS, they'll go in there and use their map viewer to estimate what they truly own, and not from my survey, which was a little bit unusual to me. But when I talked to the surveyors and the people there, they said, okay, that's what they did, because they just didn't have the money to go out and resurvey it. But if they had somewhere that they thought, you know, would be the state's, then they would surely want to argue from that standpoint. Now we see in here a little odd looking track that's there. Well, what is that? Is that the track that is the states? Well, it actually is. It is the states portion in here. They have it drawn again a little bit differently. They show this portion being all of the state's land as it meanders down through here. So they claim a lot larger piece than they actually have in here. And some of that came from my survey that I did for that portion. I said, okay, this was the state's own land in here, and they digitized it and added that portion to there. So that's what that is the state's boundary going down through here where they thought that they owned. So you can see, I won't hit that, but you can see where these state boundaries and waterways become an issue. How do you handle it? Okay, it's very complex and difficult, but I think it's one that you can manage with your GIS. All right, very good. Good luck.